Good afternoon, everyone. We've been here for at least 40 minutes, sorting out the inevitable glitches for the first forum of Semester 1 2025. Today we're meeting across Lutruwita, Tasmania, Aboriginal land, sea and waterways, online and in person here in Hobart and also up in Launceston. I acknowledge with deep respect the traditional owners of this land, the Palawa people. The Palawa people belong to the oldest continuing culture in the world. They cared and protected the country for thousands of years. They knew this land, they lived on the land, and they died on these lands, and I honour them. I pay my respects to elders past and present, to the many Aboriginal people that did not make elder status, and to the Tasmanian Aboriginal community that continued to care for country. I recognise a history of truth with which acknowledges the impacts of invasion and colonisation upon Aboriginal people, resulting in the forcible removal from their lands. Our island is deeply unique, with spectacular landscapes and our cities and towns surrounded by bushland, wilderness, mountain ranges and beaches. I stand for a future that profoundly respects and acknowledges Aboriginal perspectives, culture, language and history, and a continued effort to fight for Aboriginal justice and rights, paving the way for a strong future. And on a very personal note, I remain deeply grateful as a migrant to this place for the knowledge that's been shared with me about what it means to live well on country. Dr. Brigita Ozolins taught at the University of Tasmania, Tasmania's art school for almost 25 years. She's best known for her large-scale installations about our relationship to language, history and culture, such as Kryptos 2011 at MONA and a Tasmanian Reading Room 2019 for Detached Cultural Organisation. Brigita has been awarded grants by the Australia Council Arts Tasmania and Qantas, has had residencies in New York, immediately prior to my residency in New York, I should just point out, Paris, London and Latvia, as well as Tasmania, and has completed numerous commissions for public and private organisations, including the Tasmanian Museum and Art Gallery, the City of Hobart, 10 Days on the Island, MONA, Foma, Dark Mofo, the State Library of Tasmania, and the Soros Foundation Latvia, as well as MONA and Detached. She's represented by Bett Gallery, Hobart.
And you're also represented?
Indeed. I taught alongside Brigita for many of those years that she was here, and I remain in awe of her capacity to talk about art in a way which was utterly captivating for our undergraduate students. And it's a skill which I never have quite achieved. I don't think to the same level as Brigita, so I do mean that most sincerely. Today, Brigita is going to talk about her work, about its relationship to language as a powerful cultural tool that both shapes and restricts who and what we are and how we think. In this presentation, she'll give an overview of her practice with a focus on projects that feature books, words, and writing performances. I'm very honoured to welcome Brigita to this first forum, and I will now hand over the stage to Brigita. Please welcome her.
Oh, thank you, Neil, for that really lovely introduction. But look, your lectures and so on were always absolutely fantastic as well. Okay, hello, everyone. It's really a great pleasure to be your Art Forum guest today. And it was here in this, because it was here in this very school that I learned how to become an artist. And I'm just curious, are there many first years here? Is there anyone first year? You can learn to become an artist. It takes hard work, determination, a belief in yourself and your own creativity, and I think perhaps even more importantly, a real willingness to let go of all your preconceived ideas about what art is and what it should be. I think that's my top tip for first years just starting out here. I actually never imagined when I started here that I would end up working alongside the artists and academics who taught me, but that is what happened. And as Neil said, I taught here for almost 25 years. I'm going to give you an overview of the ideas that underpin my art and introduce you to some of my projects that incorporate the book, the word, and writing as performance. But first, I thought it might be interesting for you to find out about how I actually came to pursue a life in art at the age of 40. So a bit of an 80s shot there, your 80s big hair and a big telephone as well. So in my past lives, I worked as a librarian for the State Library and then for Glenorchy Council as their Arts and Cultural Development Officer. And I actually established the original MONA Art Centre in Hopkins Street. And when I learned an awful lot about public service, working in those jobs, but at the same time I was always hankering for something more in life, but I just wasn't sure what that was. And then in 1994, I had a dramatic accident that changed the course of my life. So I fell head first onto concrete from a balcony that had no railing, and I split my forehead open, broke most of the bones in my face, and I've been reconstructed with titanium. I feel extraordinarily lucky to be alive because landing on any other part of my head would probably have resulted in death or severe disability. But while the accident itself was a terrible thing, in a way it was also an extraordinary thing because it became a catalyst for reassessing my life. In a way, it felt like life had taken me by the shoulders and given me a big shake. And I remember lying in hospital thinking, I don't want to be on my deathbed working for Glenorchy City Council. So once I recovered, I followed a dream, applied for art school, left my job and lived on Austudy. And it was probably only about 8 years ago, I think, or even less than that, that I finished paying off the loan, you know, for Austudy. And I've never looked back. So going to art school felt like light bulbs were going off in my head. And I made art in a kind of frenzy, as if I'd stored 40 years worth of ideas inside myself. And this work here, called Important Idea, I made when I was in first year painting. I did actually do a little bit of painting in painting, first year painting class, but most of the time I worked with mixed media and collage and so on. They're really big images, they're A0 size, so the biggest ones you can photocopy, and they reflect 5 big ideas: religion, colonisation and the family, philosophy with the words of Descartes, I think therefore I am. Then we've got an image of the universe sort of representing the vastness of where we live. And right at the end is an image of me in hospital just after the accident, representing the individual. So the images are screen printed with the words, "We're not fucking important, we're just a crap idea," which is a statement from a Hal Hartley film called Trust. Now that work, Important Idea, was the beginning of an art practice in which I continued to combine text and imagery and use text as an important conceptual and aesthetic element in my artwork. And I've done this in many different ways. And in the early years of my practice, I was sort of best known really for using books, handwriting and quotes from literature in my work, when accompanied and with accompanying writing performances where I sat for hours writing with dipping pen and ink over the pages of old books. When I went to school, we had ink monitors and dipping pens and so on. In very broad terms, I make art about our relationship to language, to philosophy and lesser known aspects of history, themes that stem from my passion for books, words and libraries. And my ideas are based on the premise that language is a powerful cultural and social tool that both shapes and restricts who and what we are and how we think. On the one hand, language enables us to communicate our thoughts and discoveries with each other. But on the other hand, it can be used as a means of oppression and disinformation, as exemplified in Orwell's 1984, where language is made more and more minimal by the government to reduce ambiguity, to reduce multiple interpretations and individual thinking and questioning, and where government officials are busy rewriting history to match constant changes in policy. And it's interesting to think about that, thinking about what's happening currently in the world, in the US, in Ukraine and in Gaza. So if you haven't read 1984, I think this is a really interesting time to engage with that book, or even to reread it, written in the 1950s or late 40s. 48, was it? Yeah, thank you. So my interest in language comes from growing up speaking Latvian at home and English at school. And as my parents, who were World War II refugees, spoke a range of different languages, I was really constantly exposed to the richness and diversity of the spoken word. But one of my greatest fascinations was my father's books. He read in French, German and ancient Greek, as well as Latvian and English. And his books seemed to me to contain the secrets to the universe. Before I could read, I would sit and play with his books, staring at the pages, thinking that if I just gazed for long enough, all those symbols on the pages would suddenly reveal their meaning to me. In my artwork, I'm particularly interested in conveying the paradoxical nature of our relationship to language and the essential mystery that underscores the processes of reading and writing. And I'm really influenced by many different writers and philosophers such as Foucault, Deleuze and Guattari, Paul Auster, Leibniz, Carl Jung, Spinoza, the I Ching, just to name some of the different influences. But one of my greatest sources of inspiration is the bibliophile Alberto Manguel, who said, "Our books will bear witness for or against us. By the books we call ours, we will be judged." And I've used that particular statement in different artworks as well. Now, my work usually takes the form of installation. It's often text-based and site-specific and quite large in scale as well, and sometimes incorporates performance and some form of community engagement, and increasingly seems to depend on working with other experts such as architects, builders, engineers, and video and sound artists. So I guess I see myself as artist, as producer or director. And this way of working, which is non-traditional in its approach, offers possibilities for engaging an audience that extend beyond the experience of just standing in front of a traditional art object and contemplating its formal qualities and trying to work out what it means and how you react to it. I'm interested in giving people an experience when they engage with my work. So in this work called The Secretary, I was playing with the idea that the knowledge we store in books is an endless, fragile mystery. And to record that knowledge is an unrelenting task. And the woman in the installation features a woman sitting at a table writing while wearing wooden glasses. And I'll just show you an excerpt from that. If I can get, for some reason, I've become, let's hope this works. So the projection actually goes for quite some time. I think the sound's okay. And I got the permission to use the soundtrack from Cornelius Cardew's experimental composition, The Great Learning, which is based on the words of Confucius and which appear along the bottom half of the video. As it progresses and the voices become more cacophonous, the words also become more layered, but you actually don't see that in this. Yeah, that. This is another large-scale installation, and it was commissioned by MONA for the On the Origin of the Art exhibition, which featured 4 scientists as curators. And I worked with one of those scientists, Mark Changizi, who believes that he can explain the mystery of how language and writing emerged. So in addition to the text in the walls which say, around us, everything is writing, which are the words of the French author Marguerite Duras, there was a soundtrack that featured the voices of a child and 2 adults. I'll just see if I can. I seem to be unable to use this mouse for some reason. Here we go. You'll hear a bit of this slightly odd soundtrack. It's a bit mysterious. Can you hear it? I think that's stopped. Sorry, I'm just having so much trouble making this mouse work and do what I want it to do. I just don't want that to repeat itself. Stop. Stop. So those voices, there's sort of these percussive sounds that relate to Changizi's ideas, and the soundtracks actually emanate from those 3 objects in the middle of the room. So many of my works incorporate soundtracks because I feel that sound offers a way of heightening the experience of engaging with the work. To me, it kind of acts like a glue that brings all of the other art components together. Sometimes my work incorporates performance or some form of community engagement. So in this work called The Black Tulip, I invited women to come together and take turns reading out loud Australia's 2nd novel, Woman's Love, which was written in Tasmania in the 1820s by a woman named Mary Grimstone. And we read for an entire day. I was amazed at how many people just turned up to do this free reading, you know, to participate in this and read from the book. You can see Heather Rose up in the left, and I've forgotten her name. There's an academic down there on the right-hand corner. And some women came, they wanted to read for a second time. We started, I think, at 10 in the morning and finished at 8 at night. So Mary Grimstone's book, Woman's Love, is so rare that there are only 2 known copies in the world. One is in the Crowther collection here in the Allport in Tasmania, and the other is in the British Library, and it's never been republished. But as a result of this work, which was in the Allport Library done there, the State Library digitised the book so that everyone can now access it. I'm just going to skip over these slides. I've made quite a few works about Australia's first novelists. I've been sort of quite fascinated by them because they both wrote their works here. I made a mausoleum to both Grimstone and Savoury. I'm just going to have to whip over that because I think I've put too much in my talk. I've also made works which have been built around collections of books. And the Reading Room was an interactive installation commissioned by the Tasmanian Museum and Art Gallery that incorporated over 30,000 discarded books that I actually had to collect personally. They were stacked all through my apartment and up the stairs and in all different places. And it also included a video of over 60 people reading from a favourite book for about a minute. So the Tasmanian Museum and Art Gallery specified that this installation had to show that contemporary art could be easily accessible to the public. So the aim was to create work that was the opposite of perhaps what we think of when with some contemporary art, that it's obscure and that it's difficult and challenging and inaccessible. And here are some of the readers who are in that project. It's a while ago now, 2011, but perhaps you can recognise some of those faces there. And this project was really based on the idea, on the concept that Alberto Manguel espoused, that our books reflect who and what we are, and it's by our books we'll be judged. And it also showed that all of these books, which were actually destined for recycling, could have had a completely new and different life in a different contexts. So visitors came and they could sit in these armchairs and so on and just rifle among the books and read them, or they could sit back and just be read to. And I was delighted that TMAG staff told me that people came months after the exhibition had closed. People were still coming looking for the Reading Room because they wanted to, you know, take their kids there and read books to them and so on. So it met that aim of being more accessible contemporary art. So a more recent project I completed with books is called A Tasmanian Reading Room, and it was commissioned by art collector and patron Penny Clive. And it's really kind of hard. You can never see the work from the outside in one go because it's built in between these structural columns inside the old Mercury building, which houses, where Penny Clive has amassed really an extraordinary collection of Australian and international artworks. So the project was informed by the concept of an island, by quotes from Richard Flanagan and R.W. Giblin, an historian that Penny Clive particularly likes, as well as Alberto Manguel. So if you look on the outside of this, you'll see there are big stainless steel letters that are embedded into black wood that frames the outside of this building. And that's Alberto Manguel's quotes, "Our books will bear witness for or against us," that's actually been bedded in the outside. And when you first enter through this little arched doorway, you come across a library of about 2,000 books, all of them with a Tasmanian theme and connection. And then you enter the circular reading room. Let me see if I can get this sound thing happening. Yes, I've got it happening. Then you enter this circular reading room, which has a domed ceiling and a hand-painted map of Tasmania, and a round table with a quote from Tasmanian author Richard Flanagan that is about the progression and circularity of words and stories, which are hand-painted around its perimeter. But the heart of the project really is this soundtrack where 42 people read from a book of their choice about Tasmania. And you're just about to hear one of Tasmania's authors reading from a book. We'll just hear a little bit of that.
Around the base of the cliff was a skirt of kelp, churned by the lime-green froth of broken waves. The low winter sun broke the clouds, and they watched without speaking the sets rolling in, the peaks forming and rising, teetering at the roller coaster cusp of collapse, and then smashing apart on the cliff face below them. 1, 2, then 3, the crescendo, augmented by the backwash of the others, a giant explosion sending great fans of spray into the air, moistening their faces with the mist caught up on the breeze.
And what happens there is sometimes other voices join, and you get this cacophony sometimes of many, many voices reading at once, and then it disappears. And I've used mirrors in this as well to give this idea that writing about Tasmania and our ideas and thinking about Tasmania and the library is something that's continuous and goes on forever. As I showed you earlier, I've also done a number of performances, especially in my early work where I repeatedly wrote over the pages of all old books. So in this work, I'm sitting in the separate prison chapel at Port Arthur, writing over the pages, writing the words, "The truth shall make you free," over Australia's first novel, which was written by Henry Savoury. So he pipped Mary Grimstone at the post with his novel, published in 1830-31, and hers was published in 1832. And he died at Port Arthur, a convicted criminal. He's buried on the Isle of the Dead, probably as a result of a botched suicide attempt where he cut his own throat. Interestingly, Mary Grimstone, Australia's second novelist, also died as a result of suicide by consuming disinfectant. So very sad stories associated with our literary firsts. Anyway, I was writing "The Truth Shall Make You Free" over the pages of that first novel, a copy of it, symbolically trying to release Savoury from his past. Now, this is another one. In the learning, I sat in a Tasmanian forest reading a blank book, or seemingly a blank book, wearing those wooden glasses that I wore in the secretary, that work I showed you right at the beginning, again made out of little tree rings. And the work is about the links between nature and culture, and it's implied that this woman sitting in the forest can see what we cannot see, and that her vision is somehow embedded in the natural world. Move on from there. I actually personally love watching that video. I kind of get hypnotized by watching myself turning those pages. That video was also accompanied by a series of digital images layered over photos of the pages in that book. So that's actually a photograph of that book where I was turning the pages, which is a really old atlas. And it had the shadows of maps that were coming through. There were maps on the maps folded in two in between the pages. And this particular work featured a ghostly map of Tasmania and the wooden glasses that I wore during that performance. And as I said, I've increasingly been working with other experts like architects, builders, and video and sound artists. So my work Kryptos, which is now over 15 years old, involved working with engineers, with an architect, with a sound artist, and the construction company who built MONA. So it was quite sort of complex. And the work starts by taking you down a corridor where the walls are lined with concrete and feature a line of binary code, and there are actually words in there. Who's seen Kryptos? And some of you, if you haven't, you'll have to go to MONA and check it out. It's probably the work that I'm best known for because it's in such a fantastic art gallery. But there are words in amongst the binary code, and then and the work actually responds to these items in David Walsh's collection that show cuneiform, which is the oldest form of writing known to us. And it translates sections from a book called The Epic of Gilgamesh, which tells the story of the king of Uruk, Gilgamesh, who is all-powerful. He goes on manly adventures with his friend Enkidu. He gets to have sex with all the virgins before they get married. And he goes on big hunting expeditions. But the one thing that he can't do with all of that power is bring anyone back from the dead. So when his friend Enkidu dies, he realises the limits of his power and becomes aware of his own mortality. So that work, Kryptos, is really about that. All that binary code translates sections from the Epic of Gilgamesh. This central part is about, the first section is about having a secret, knowing a secret. The second one is about lightness and dark. And the final chamber is about seeing the voice, seeing the face of death and hearing the voice of death. And all of that final chamber is lined with lead, and all of the binary code has a micron of gold on it. So that idea of transformation. I've got a little video of that final, of entering that final chamber. And of course, it's got a separate soundtrack in each chamber. And in that final chamber, I don't know whether you'll be able to see this very well. See, there's the word death. And you see yourself hanging from the ceiling. The mirror in that work is actually the speaker. So it's got a transducer. And the mirror was actually the very first thing that went in when they built Kryptos. And I glued every one of those numerals to the walls myself. It took me about 2 months. It was very, very hot in that central chamber, I'm telling you. I'm getting towards the end now. Some of my work uses large-scale text to draw people into the messages I'm trying to convey, such as this work in the Tasmanian Museum and Art Gallery called Look On, which responded to the painting The Onlooker by Emmanuel Phillips Fox, which is just opposite there. And interestingly, as an aside, my partner actually is a picture framer, framed that painting. So it was... So I've used this large-scale text. In Latvia, I created this work called Spogulis, which means mirror in Latvian, for the Soros Foundation, on the windows of 2 libraries that made up the National Library of Latvia at the time. And so I was making a statement here about the library being a reflection of Latvia's history and culture. And more recently, I used large-scale text on a building in Macquarie Street, just opposite the Tasmanian Museum and Art Gallery, for the inaugural Hobart Current exhibition. And the theme of that show was liberty, and the 8 artists who participated had to make work about the concept of liberty. And why my work was really about the links between language and freedom. And the words, I raise up my voice, are the words of Malala Yousafzai, a Pakistani woman who was the youngest person to ever receive a Nobel Peace Prize. She was 17 years old and she had been shot in the face by the Taliban for advocating for the right for education for girls in countries where their educational opportunities are severely limited or non-existent. And the full quote is, "I raise up my voice, not so that I can shout, but so that those without a voice can be heard." And I was really delighted that you could actually see this from the waterfront. I was even on a ferry going to Mona and I could see it from way out. And it was really kind of, it was exciting to see that the work had that impact on the skyline of Hobart. So the words have been rendered in clouds. So they're printed on that stuff that they put on buses, you know, that on the outside they cover buses, but you can see from the inside, you can see out. And my niece said that they looked biblical, as if the words themselves had been sent down from the heavens. I really liked that comment. Of course, their significance really changes with context. But when I first came up with the idea and installed the work, it was at the height of the Me Too and Black Lives Matter movements. And there were lots of demonstrations everywhere and people were demonstrating on the street corner just outside this building, you know, underneath those words as well. And this is a drone view of it being installed. So I'm coming up to my very last work. I want to end with this project that I did in Ventspils in Latvia in 2023. It was a 9-hour performance commemorating the 15,500 Latvians who were deported to gulags in Siberia on the night of the 13th and 14th of June 1941. I performed on a stage in the Ventspils marketplace made of packing crates, which evoked the cattle trains that were used to deport those who were arrested. I spent about 5 hours nailing 503 copies of the pages from a book titled "These Names Accuse." And the book lists the secret Soviet documents and lists of everyone who was deported on that night, their names, their birth dates and their addresses. And for the next 4 hours, after that, I started to write by hand the names of everyone arrested just in Ventspils. And I only got to, the lists are in alphabetical order, I only got to F. The book itself, These Names Accused, was published in Sweden not long, a few years after World War II. And it bears witness really to what the Soviets did to all of the Baltic peoples, because it wasn't just Latvians, it was Lithuanians and Estonians as well who were deported on that night. And it was, for me, the most moving performance that I've ever done. In Latvia, everyone knows someone who vanished on that night, grandparents, neighbours, relatives. The Soviets arrested all the intelligentsia, as well as people of influence, journalists, policemen, teachers, academics, property owners, business people, all accused of being enemies of their Soviet occupiers, all a threat to the dominance of Soviet rule at the time. And my mother was 14 years old then on that night when, and she witnessed her friend Aldona Ikmanis being arrested. Aldona was 13 years old. And my mother hid behind a tree, unable to understand why her school friend, whose father was a police commissioner, was being loaded into a truck in her nightgown. So the work drew lots of spectators and people who came up to the stage looking for the names of their relatives and sharing stories of families and friends who were deported. And it also made news on national TV the front page of the local newspaper and resulted in a radio interview on the equivalent of Radio National and a 6-page article in a journal about my art practice. So it was, I hadn't expected all of those things. And look, this is in Latvian, but I just thought I'd show you the TV report because it'll give you a bit of an idea of what it was like doing this performance. Why won't it go? There we go. You'll hear a bit of Latvian here. It was a very hot day.
Savukārt šodien Ventspilī pie tirgus laukuma skatuves sienas tika...
Oh, bummer. Is it going to?
Pienaglotas īpaši slepeno dokumentu kopijas, kurās norādīti 1941. gada 13. un 14. jūnijā arestēto personu vārdi, dzimšanas datumi un adreses. Māksliniece un rakstniece Brigita Ozolins, kura savā dzīvesvietā Tasmānijā ir labi pazīstama ar savām laikmetīgās mākslas performancēm un liela mēroga instalācijām, šo performanci veltīja savas mātes Mirdas Ozolins un viņas draudzenes Aldonas Ikmanas piemiņai, kura bija izsūtīto vidū. Visu dienu Brigita pavadīja uz papīra lapām ar roku rakstot visu Ventspilī arestēto cilvēku vārdus. Pēc katras lapas aizpildīšanas viņa pieskandināja zvanu un lapu pienagloja pie skatuves sienas līdzās pārējām lapām. Brigita Ozolins šobrīd strādā Ventspils starptautiskajā rakstnieku un tulkotāju mājā, kur viņa rediģē romānu, ko sarakstījusi par savas mātes bēgšanu no Latvijas 2. pasaules kara laikā.
Oh. How do I get out of the YouTube thing? Escape. Go. I just want my last slide. Oh, there we go. So that's it. I have that. I have sort of come to the end of the talk. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'm really happy to take any questions if you have them. And you can find out, I've skimmed over so many things, you can find out on my website about so much more and watch excerpts of videos in more extended form and so on as well.
Thank you so much, Brigita, for your generous sharing of your compelling work. I'm sure there might be some comments or questions in the room. I'm using the microphone because we're streaming via Zoom and there are other folks out there listening in. I've also got my laptop open, so I'll be monitoring the chat if anybody would like to ask a question online. But is there anyone in the room who'd like to ask Brigita a question?
You mentioned working with other people like audio designers and like other specialists and stuff. I was wondering, like, would you have any advice for like smaller artists who would want to like incorporate that into their works, or like just tips in general for that kind of collaboration?
Oh, that's a great question, actually. I think when you're starting out, when you're a student, get together with somebody else who's doing, you know, a course in sound or working with that. I think work with other people who are working in those things and collaborate on some smaller projects to work on that. That's what I did as an undergrad. I, you know, found someone in a friend who was doing screen printing, who screen printed over my big images. You know, I had the vision in my head. The sound stuff I was only sort of really doing sort of later on, but I'd always sort of look out and try and find someone else who was working in an area, you know, similar to what I wanted to do, and to try and experiment with it. Does that help?
It's a great question. In fact, of course, in some of our core units, we actively encourage and engage that, because we're the School of Creative Arts and Media involving a range of different disciplines. So you'll get plenty of opportunity to do that. So yeah, it's a great opportunity. In my experience, it's also about like-minded folks. So folks who are into art and other stuff just coalescing at a particular moment in time, just coming together. And then sometimes an idea emerges, or sometimes it's coalescing around an idea, isn't it? But yeah, Brigita, you're very good at it too.
Oh, yeah. I don't know. It sort of happened by accident in some way, or, you know, starting to incorporate all those things. But I believe there are courses, I'm a little bit out of the loop in what the units are that you study, but I believe there are ones where you study with music students and media students. So what a great opportunity to, you know, work across disciplines then.
Indeed.
There was some there.
That's all right. All good.
I'll get that later. Thank you for this. This has been brilliant. Obviously, language is a core component of your work, and you've got such like refined and sophisticated design sensibilities. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your choice in typography and design, what role that plays in your work.
Oh, I better get over to the mic. Gosh, I haven't. My choice in typography, well, it kind of, it really depends on the project. I like minimal, you know, less is more, but it depends on the statement that I'm making and what I'm doing. So for things like I raise up my voice, I wanted something very minimal, not twirly whirly. I had thought about using, I often contemplate a number of different ideas. So I had thought of using like a mirrored perspex, so not perspex, vinyl over the windows that sort of flashed in and out and reflected the sky, but you can't get that in the vinyl that you can see through. And I had to think about the people who were in the building, who had offices there, who would, you know, would have their view blocked for a couple of months as well. It really is about the context of the work and where it's being shown. I mean, there are other ones like I flashed over Grimstone and Savoury, where I had these big gold letters, sort of like big badges that are on the outside of this mausoleum that I built for them. Well, they're incredibly decorative, and the G for Grimstone has a tulip in it, and the Savoury is also sort of very decorative because that's kind of reflecting, you know, the early 1800s and the type of typography that was used then. And in fact, for the catalogue for that book, the designer who did that for me used a typeface that was very similar to the typeface used for the publication of those books. So I think it's about thinking about the entire context of the project. I'll tell you one interesting thing about fonts and so on. When I was installing Kryptos, if you've been in there, you'll see that the ones actually have most ones have like a little leg, a little foot up the top. So a little sort of curly bit. The zeros are okay. It took me ages actually to find the right font. And I decided on the one that had the little kick like that, because it's very hard to find a number font that is just a straight one. You'd have to use the letter I. Anyway, I was installing all of the letters in the first chamber, just the zeros and ones, and David Walsh would visit me every day, and he came in and he said, "Oh, have you thought about getting rid of that little thing on the one? You could just cut them all off." And I thought, 3,000 letters. And he kind of wanted me to cut them all off. And I had to sort of think quickly. And I said, it's really important that it's got that little kick on it, because it makes it easier. You don't notice if the letter is slightly wobbly. And also, it kind of looks like a musical note when you get into the final chamber and it's reflected in the glass ceiling. So it's about context, really.
I know there are more questions in the room, but I'm afraid we have to be out of here now. I know we've got students that need to get to classes. Perhaps if Brigita's got another 5 minutes, she might be able to have a chat with you outside. But please join me once again in thanking Brigita for her fascination.
Thanks so much. I'll go out. I'll go and